Welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. This week, and for the next 2 weeks, we'll be following a year-end tradition here in the basement by going off topic. This year, I'd like to discuss two Paul McCartney and Wings albums, 1979's Back to the Egg and 1980's McCartney 2, along with the singles and the circumstances surrounding them. Part of the reason I want to discuss both albums is that, despite all his success, I've always felt that Paul McCartney during this period was a highly reactive artist. Every new album was shaped in large part by the public and critical response to the prior album. So to understand the new Paul McCartney record, you always had to look at how the last one was received. This week in these three cubicles, I placed some of the new and notable albums from May of 1979 when Back to the Egg was released. Wings' prior album, London Town, had spent 6 weeks at number 2 in the spring of 1978 behind the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. I'm sure the McCartney organization felt that if it hadn't been for unfortunate timing with the juggernaut Saturday Night Fever, London Town would have spent 6 weeks at number 1. The album's lead-off single, With a Little Luck, had gone to number 1. 2 further singles barely made the top 40, but in all, the album was another in a string of McCartney mega hits. Personally, I thought London Town had some nice stuff on it, along with a lot of forgettable stuff, and overperformed for what it was. It seemed like the success had more to do with McCartney's name and reputation than the quality of the record. McCartney was an almost unparalleled star in the late 70s. He had also just left Capitol Records, where he had spent his entire career, to sign a huge deal with Columbia, which, it was widely reported, made him the highest paid rock star in the world. With Elton John seemingly deliberately having turned down the heat on his career, which is something else I'd like to do an off-topic episode on sometime, Paul McCartney was once again probably the biggest rock star in the world. It's understandable that he would have approached his new album with great confidence. McCartney and Wings' first release for Columbia was a non-album single, Goodnight Tonight, with Daytime Nighttime Suffering on the B-side, released on March 15, 1979 in the US and on March 23rd in the UK. It had been a year since the release of London Town. The single was released as a 4-minute 18-second standard 7-inch and as a 7-minute 25-second 12-inch single, becoming the first McCartney and Wings single released in that format. The release was accompanied by a promotional video. The term music video still hadn't been coined at the time. The new single, like London Town before it, was credited to Wings and introduced 2 new Wings members, guitarist Lawrence Juber and drummer Steve Holley, replacing Jimmy McCulloch and Joe English, who had both left after the main recording but before the release of London Town. Juber was the 3rd lead guitarist for the group, and Holley was the 4th drummer since Wings formed in 1971. The instrumental track had been recorded earlier in 1978, and it was finished during the sessions for the still-to-come Back to the Egg album. Coming arguably at the height of disco mania in the spring of '79, it seemed inevitable that McCartney, like nearly everyone else, would go disco. At the time, I was disappointed to see him jumping on the bandwagon instead of forging a new direction. Even so, the single was undeniably catchy and done with much more class, style, and melody than most of the disco records that were coming out at the time. The bass line and the vocals are excellent. He may have gone disco, but at least he did it well. Interestingly, in later years, McCartney has strongly stated his preference for the B-side, Daytime Nighttime Suffering, which had been recorded in the spring of '78. I don't understand that at all. It's one of my least favorite McCartney tracks. I find it too sing-song with a music track that doesn't match the lyric at all. Suffering seems to be dismissed with a casual shrug musically. The melody to me never rises much above being a dull nursery rhyme. McCartney certainly hears something there that I don't. Maybe there's some positive association for him. I've also wondered if later on there was a period when he found the disco-fied A-side embarrassing and chose to focus attention on the B-side when the subject came up. The single was a huge success, going to number 5 in the US and in the UK. Still, for McCartney, routinely used to going to number 1, it might have come as a mild disappointment. McCartney's certainly one of the few artists that could be disappointed with a number 5 showing, but I think it might also account for his later preference for the B-side. Neither side of the single was on Back to the Egg when it was released on May 24th. The UK release came on June 8th. It was heavily hyped in magazines and newspapers and on radio and television, and there were promotional items like badges and this set of little sports type cards with the photos from the back cover of the album and a little bio for each band member on the back. I'm not exactly sure how these were used or distributed, but they're kind of a cool little item. Very unusually and no doubt expensively in these pre-MTV days, a television special was created for Back to the Egg with promotional clips for 7 of the album tracks plus Goodnight Tonight. I'll be including shots from those promos while discussing the album. Among my initial impressions was that the album title was stupid. I suppose it's a reference to starting over or going back to basics, but apart from the fact that there's 2 new guys in Wings, which doesn't seem all that significant, it doesn't seem to apply to the album. In fact, when I told my friend Frank that I had heard that the new Wings album was going to be called Back to the Egg, he thought it was some kind of limp joke that I was trying to play on him. I let it drop, and I remember his shock when he saw the album and discovered that that really was the title. I liked the cover with the photo of the group, and the vaguely sci-fi theme worked better for me then than it does now. The statue on the mantelpiece is a nice callback to the cover of the Wings Greatest collection released for the holidays in 1978. Wings are grouped symmetrically with McCartney at the center in an arrangement that always reminded me vaguely of Da Vinci's Last Supper. The 2 new Wings, Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley, underwhelmed me. It had nothing to do with them as people or as musicians. It was just that for a while, Wings had seemed to finally gel with McCulloch and English, who had even written songs and or done lead vocals on Wings albums. It was also the lineup that toured the US in 1976. Later on, McCartney would also recall the McCulloch-English lineup as his favorite incarnation of the band. The new guys kind of looked alike and had a sort of generic mainstream pop star appearance. I wasn't sure I was in any mood to get to know them, since with Wings' history, I was sure they'd be gone in an album or 2 anyway. In fact, at this point, another round of personnel changes had made the whole Wings concept look faintly ridiculous. When I got the album home, another thing that struck me about it was that it seemed to have too many themes going on. There's the literal chicken egg theme with eggs shown on the album label and the sides titled Sunny Side Up and Over Easy. An illustration of what appears to be a cathedral ceiling or a very elaborate barn is on the inner sleeve. At first, it didn't seem to mean anything, but I think the center is meant to represent a nesting bird, part of the egg theme. There's the spaceship theme on the front cover, in which Earth seems to be the egg. Then there are the musical themes. McCartney had famously come up with the trick of making an album feel like a concept album with a thematic cover, and by framing the music with an introductory song and a reprise, which of course he'd first used on Sgt. Pepper. Since then, he'd used it to good effect on Ram, Band on the Run, and Venus and Mars. Back to the Egg opens with the track Reception, which is echoed near the end of side 2 with The Broadcast creating a theme. Then the third track is We're Open Tonight, introducing another theme. It sounds like the Venus and Mars linking tracks and is reprised at the end of the second to last track, creating another theme and framework for the album. Reportedly, We're Open Tonight had originally been planned as the album's title. Then there are the 2 Rockestra tracks spread across side 2, creating the impression of yet another theme. Settling on any one of these themes might have been effective, although the egg theme seems a little silly. Of course, having a bunch of themes ends up creating no theme at all and just looking a bit confused. The album features a wide variety of styles, including obvious nods to disco and to punk new wave. Certainly that's not unusual for McCartney. Way back to Beatles days, he obviously enjoys exploring different musical styles. By 1979, though, you get the impression that to some extent he's hedging his bets by incorporating different genres, not wanting to fully jump on any bandwagon, but also worried that he might seem out of touch if he doesn't show his awareness of current trends. Between the introductory tracks Reception and We're Open Tonight, we get the first of the album's big numbers, Getting Closer, a kind of tepid rocker. It's not bad, but not particularly outstanding, especially by the standards of Paul McCartney. Though it wasn't well known at the time, it was a tune he'd had around since at least 1973. The fact that it took him 6 years to finish it makes me think he didn't have any particular enthusiasm for it himself. Getting Closer was the lead-off single in the US, released on June 5th, nearly 2 weeks after the album. The B-side was Spin It On. It'll spend 2 weeks at number 20, beginning July 28th, before dropping all the way to number 76 1 week later. For the lead-off single for a new McCartney album to only hit number 20 would have been seen as disappointing, to say the least. It was probably the most surprising miss of any McCartney record up to this point. To date, the lead-off single from every McCartney or Wings studio album had gone to number 1, apart from Jet from Band on the Run, which had gone to number 7, and in that case, the second single, Band on the Run, went to number 1. Of course, there were no singles released from McCartney or from Wildlife. A number 20 showing for Getting Closer must have come as a shock. Getting Closer became the second single from the album in the UK, where it'll be released on August 16th as a double A-side with Baby's Request. It featured a ridiculous man walking a lobster picture sleeve from Hypnosis. Getting Closer will only go to number 60 in the UK. The fourth track and the second fully realized song on the album is the punk-influenced Spin It On. Punk influence here mostly means played very fast. Otherwise, it still sounds like McCartney, and I mean that in a positive way. It's a track I really like, and I especially like the spinning sound of Lawrence Juber's first guitar break. We're back in more familiar territory with the next track, Denny Lane's Again and Again and Again. After 5 co-writing credits on their last album, London Town, Denny Lane's only writing credit on Back to the Egg is here. Though he's the only credited writer, the song takes so many McCartney-esque turns that I'll bet McCartney is an uncredited co-writer. That's followed by Old Siam Sir, which was the lead-off single in the UK, released on June 1st, a week before the album. The B-side was Spin It On. It did even worse than Getting Closer had done in the US, peaking at number 35. It's a strange choice. It was meant to be a rocker with a vaguely East Asian flavor, but to me, it just kind of thuds along. If you thought the lyric, "I'm getting closer, my salamander," was uninspiring, brace yourself for the words of Old Siam Sir. McCartney's lyrics are often more about the phonetic sound of the words than any literal meaning, like, for instance, the Jailer Man and Sailor Sam. When it works, they paint a mental picture and at least suggest a deeper meaning. On Old Siam Sir, the words and even the title sound like they were improvised completely based on sound and read like a first draft by somebody making it up as they go along. It's vaguely about a woman looking for a man, but it's mostly unintelligible, unrelatable, and sounds distinctly unfinished. Side 1 closes with the Stevie Wonder-influenced Arrow Through Me. It's probably the strongest track on the album and would have made a great lead-off single, better than Getting Closer, except I suspect the sound and disco feel was too close to Wings' prior single, Goodnight Tonight. I imagine if they'd followed up with this, people would have thought that McCartney had fully embraced disco and he wasn't going that far. They probably also considered that putting out 2 such similar feeling singles in a row would diminish the returns for the second one. It will become the second single from the album when it's released on August 14th with Old Siam Sir on the B-side. It'll go to number 29 on October 13th. By the standards of follow-up singles from recent Wings albums, the performance was roughly average. I'm sure they hoped for more, but they probably got about what they expected. Side 2 begins with the Rockestra theme. The Rockestra, of course, was a huge supergroup that McCartney assembled at Abbey Road Studios on October 3rd, 1978. In addition to Wings, players included David Gilmour, Hank Marvin, Pete Townsend, John Bonham, Kenny Jones, John Paul Jones, Ronnie Lane, Bruce Thomas from Elvis Costello's Attractions, Tony Ashton, Gary Brooker, and Ray Cooper. McCartney once again shows his talent for specialty work by putting together a rockestra theme that's effectively powerful while being simple enough that all the players don't turn it into a cacophonous mess. The same can be said for the second rockestra performance, So Glad to See You Here, which is the second to last track on the album and features vocals later overdubbed by McCartney and Wings. The rockestra theme is followed by another pretty decent rocker, To You, which holds up surprisingly well coming right after the rockestra. For most of side 2, McCartney returns to one of his by now well-known tricks of creating a medley out of song fragments. We'd seen it used among other places on the second side of Abbey Road, on Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey, and on the medley on Red Rose Speedway. When it works well, the whole becomes more than the sum of the parts. It doesn't work that well here. The fragments don't really come together, and the effect is more that McCartney is filling up side 2 with bits and pieces that he's never bothered to finish. The album ends, as so many McCartney albums do, with a song that feels like a tag. In this case, it's the 40s style crooner Baby's Request, which was a late addition to the album and reportedly originally written for the Mills Brothers, who I would have loved to hear sing it. We're used to McCartney throwing in a pre-rock nostalgia number, and this one, stylistically, helps round out the album. As McCartney nostalgia numbers go, this is actually one of his best and another album highlight. I found it an album that gives us a lot, but between all the themes and fragments, fails to create an overall impression. Put simply, there's too much going on and too little of any consequence. I think in some ways, McCartney may have been trying too hard to create a mega seller for his first outing with Columbia. At the same time, there may have been some hubris involved with McCartney, now the world's highest paid rock star, and London Town having been so successful despite its shortcomings. I think if London Town hadn't done quite as well, McCartney would have actually worked harder on this. McCartney was certainly no stranger to bad reviews even on some of his biggest sellers, and the critics were especially hard on Back to the Egg. Rolling Stone called it just about the sorriest grab bag of dreck in recent memory. The album was by no means a bomb. It reached number 8 in the US. It was, however, the first original McCartney and/or Wings album not to reach number 1 or number 2, apart from the extremely lightweight Wildlife, which had peaked at number 10 in 1971. In the UK, Back to the Egg got to number 6. It's unlikely that the television special did much good. It wasn't shown in the US until November 1979, 6 months after the album was released, and then it was on TBS, which was a basic cable station at a time when most people didn't have cable. Most people who might have wanted to watch it wouldn't have had access anyway. It'll fare worse in the UK, where it won't be broadcast until June 1981. The fact that they went to the trouble and expense of creating the TV special seems like another indication that the album was expected to be a monster smash hit, and the tepid airing that it received certainly seemed like another reminder that it wasn't. As usual, McCartney's view is shaped by the public response. In a 1986 interview, he derisively called Back to the Egg a bombcept rather than a concept album, and added, they thought it was good while they were making it, but it never came together. After the big hype surrounding Back to the Egg made its relative failure seem all the more obvious, it's unsurprising that the always reactive McCartney will go a completely different direction the next time out. More about that in part 2. Meanwhile, hope you enjoyed this off-topic episode. Hope you're having great holidays. Please join me next time for part 2. Meanwhile, I look forward to your comments on this. Please hit like if you don't mind and subscribe if you haven't. Have a great week. Bye.